Where the Stars Do Not Take Sides by Witch of Endor. Chapter 4. Hubris is a bitch. And how does it feel now that you scratch that itch? Hold out all your stitches. Hubris is a bitch. Zuko remembers writing a letter to Azula maybe a week or two into his exile. In retrospect, Zuko can see that he was feverish at the time, and his attempt at a letter had probably made little sense. But he'd screamed for Azula when he'd first awoken on the ship, and all Mother had said was that Azula would be fine. Except Zuko hadn't been fine, and if they could do that to Zuko, who was to say that they wouldn't do it to Azula? Yes, she was the favorite, but what if she falls out of favor? Zuko must have said something along those lines to Mother, because he remembers her response. Nobody will touch her, she's the heir. He remembers being confused because Uncle Iroh was the heir to the throne. But then days had passed in a haze of pain and healing, and Zuko had learned that his grandfather had died and his father had ascended the throne. The Fire Lord had died because of Mother. Zuko's last memories of his grandfather are him holding Zuko's wrists as Father called fire to his palm, of his grandfather on the stone floor still, and Mother holding a heavy dragon sculpture in her hands. So Azula really was the heir to the throne. But that didn't stop Zuko from wanting to at least ask her if she wanted to join them. She'd say no, Zuko was sure of that. But she should at least be given the choice, shouldn't she? And even if she said no, Zuko wanted to say goodbye. Mother had found him writing that letter and had made him burn it. Zuko was still terrified of fire at the time, but he did it anyway, tears stinging at his good eye all the while. He'd wanted to say goodbye to Azula so badly that burning the letter had hurt more than his wound, more than the fear of fire. Later, Mother had sat him down and explained their situation, explained that the rest of the Fire Nation thought they were dead. Fire Lord Ozai knew the truth, and anyone that he decided to tell, and that meant that they had to keep moving. Zuko never wrote to Azula again. Every now and then in that first year, Zuko had drafted letters in his mind while watching Mother deteriorate. Things he would tell Azula, things he would ask her, but he didn't write a single word. They chain Zuko's hands so that they're pressed together. It's standard for firebenders to ensure that they can't bend from their hands without burning themselves. They don't tie Zuko's feet, but Zuko assumes that's because he isn't a very good firebender. It's at least an hour before Azula joins him. Zuko isn't sure whether this is due to her needing to oversee the running of the ship, or if it's a power play. He supposes it doesn't matter. Azula stands outside the cell with her arms crossed and stares him down. Zuko meets her eyes. He's a little grateful, in a twisted way, for the opportunity just to look at her. Everything is calm now. There's no fighting or running. Zuko doesn't even feel panicked anymore because there's no point. He knows what happens from this point onwards. There is no escape, and anyway, he's given Azula his word that he won't try. How did Mother die? Azula asks eventually. Zuko nods, acknowledging her question as he thinks. And then he says, slowly. Illness? Injury followed by illness, Zuko answers. She was hurt the night we left. She never quite got over it. Azula watches his face, and then her eyes shift to the right to look specifically at his scar. You were injured too. Grandfather? Father, Zuko corrects, though grandfather ordered it. Do you know why? No more than you do, Zuko replies, because Azula had been the one to present that information after all. Azula had known before Zuko that Zuko was to be sacrificed at the altar of their father's ambition. Azula's eyebrows draw in. She looks like she's about to respond, and then she holds herself back. She reverts to staring, and Zuko takes in every detail of her face. She looks so much like Mother. She'll probably look even more like Mother when she's an adult. You let me think you were dead. Zuko doesn't reply because there's nothing to say to that. He just continues looking while he can at the sweep of her cheekbones and the gold of her eyes. He can see the little girl he used to know, the one who was harsh and competitive, who was a prodigy, who was whip-smart and wouldn't let anyone take advantage of her. You're not going to deny that? Why would I? Zuko asks. Azula's jaw clenches and her eyes narrow. Why did you let me think you were dead? Zuko hesitates. I didn't have another option. You could have said goodbye that night, Azula snaps. You could have written. You could have come back after Mother died. Zuko nods. I could have, he agrees. And I would have died. It's a choice. Azula isn't wrong about that. He did choose life over her. He wonders if she thinks less of him for it. Azula's breathing is very even. They fall back into silence. Long minutes later, Azula asks, Why did you join the Avatar? This is where Zuko has to be careful. Any information about Aang could be used against him. He already said too much about the Avatar state. Zuko can only hope that Azula already knew about it from Aang's earlier use because he hates the idea that he sold information to Aang's enemy, even if he did it to save Aang and Katara. Zuko wets his lips. I had nothing to lose, he says eventually. Azula's eyes narrow. Not your loyalty to your nation? Not your honor? I don't think I have any of that left, Zuko admits. And then he adds, The Earth Kingdom is starving. Did you realize that? The Fire Nation has decimated it. The war, The Avatar can restore balance. Azula rolls her eyes, clearly unimpressed. You sound like Avatar propaganda, she says. Zuko only hums in response. The siblings revert to staring at one another. Eventually, Azula's friends come down to find her. Zuko recognizes them both, though it takes a moment. Azula has retained the same friendships she had in girlhood. Zuko had never been good at friendship, had never been allowed to spend time with kids his own age anyway, so Azula's friends were the closest things he had to friends as a child. He spent many days with Ty Lee and May, and he's impressed that the three of them are still loyal to one another. Zuko has only had friends a number of weeks. He can't imagine years. It doesn't matter what he can and can't imagine anyway. The remainder of his life can be measured in days at most. Oh! Ty Lee says, staring through the bars at Zuko. Her eyes are watering. She looks at Azula, who shrugs some kind of acquiescence, and then Ty Lee is standing at Zuko's bars. Zuko! Hello? Zuko replies awkwardly. How does one greet an old sort of friend who is involved in the ending of his life? It doesn't seem like an it's nice to see you kind of scenario. Ty Lee draws a shaking breath and then says, Azula, he looks so much like you! And immediately bursts into tears. Zuko sits back more than a little alarmed and watches as Azula and May wear matching long-suffering expressions. After a few moments, Ty Lee catches her breath and turns to Zuko again. We went to your funeral, she says. Zuko nods because she seems to be waiting for a response. We weren't supposed to. Children under 10, it's unseemly, of course, but we snuck in behind the curtains. Ty Lee, Azula interjects. Enough. Ty Lee falls quiet and holds on to the bars of Zuko's cell. Zuko takes a steadying breath. He hadn't realized there had been a funeral. That seems very official. Maybe the Fire Lord had needed to do it for appearances. When did you all find out I was alive? He asks. I told them a few days after I found you, Azula explains. But when did you find out? Zuko asks again, looking toward his sister. When did the Fire Lord tell you? You obviously didn't know when it happened. Azula hesitates, visibly taken aback this time. She starts, and then apparently gets a hold of herself. I found out when I saw you. It's not like I'm going to forget my own face. Zuko pauses, and then nods. So he never told you. Why should he? Azula asks. It's not like you're important, or, she adds, thoughtful, you weren't important until you went and joined the Avatar. May sighs as if this is all very boring. Can we get to the part where we get information on the Avatar already? What a good idea, May, Azula responds. Zuko lifts his chin. I'm not going to tell you anything. He watches as a smile creeps across his sister's expression. Well, that might be the case now, she says. But I'm sure you'll have a change of heart at the palace. The winds have always liked Azula, and even when they haven't, she has been able to direct ships through them with ease. What could you say? Azula is just lucky. So it's hardly a surprise that they're making it to the palace in record time. She isn't worried. She's not. Zuko hasn't said anything concerning, after all. She just hasn't been able to look at his face this closely before, and the scar is somehow even worse than she had been remembering it. It morphs the shape of the skin around his eye, causing it to be fixed in a permanent scowl. And Zuko might not have been much of a firebender when they were kids, but he did have an inner fire. And Azula knows well that it is difficult to get a firebender's skin to burn. Azula gives her crew stern instructions and then returns to her own rooms. It isn't because she's wary about looking at her brother. Azula just has to run through her plans. Zuko is hardly an open book, but he has told her that the scar comes from that night. Grandfather had ordered Zuzu's death, and Father had burned half his face off. What was the plan? To just keep going until Zuko's brain melted out his ears? Death by fire might be one of the most honorable forms of death penalty in the Fire Nation, but it's usually reserved for non-benders and done on a pyre, not held down and blasted in the face. Azula breathes very deeply, falling into a meditative state. There is no use in dwelling on the past. There is only the present and the future. The past is only relevant inasmuch as it is useful. Father had known that Mother and Zuzu were alive, and had let Azula think otherwise. She is Father's right-hand woman. Would he have ever told her? Eventually, May and Ty Lee arrive. Azula lets them into the cabin, and May leans against her desk as Ty Lee paces the available space. "Are you sure about this, Azula?" Ty Lee asks. "What if the Fire Lord doesn't want to see him?" May sighs. "Of course the Fire Lord doesn't want to see him," she points out. "He left him to rot in the Earth Kingdom." "He has information on the Avatar," Azula reminds them. "He's a useful prisoner. I need 2 days, 3 at most," she estimates. "Father won't deny me if I show him that it's logical to let him live. You always need an heir and a spare after all, and a few years of convincing should turn him into a decent spare." "If he's not going to be a useful spare for a few years, then you'll be old enough to have children," Ty Lee says. "Then he's not useful anymore." Azula scowls. "Or he can have children," she suggests. "I'll be too busy for that. And anyway, he's sickeningly good with them, apparently. I don't want any." "The Fire Lord won't let him raise the next in line," May states. Azula glares. "There won't be a problem once the Avatar is out of the way, and we have a few days to iron this out. Once Father sees Zuko turning on the Avatar, providing us with information, it will be easier to convince him." Ty Lee bites at her nails and watches Azula with wide, concerned eyes. May just sighs unhelpfully. Zuko thinks about his friends. He wonders, of course, what conclusions they might draw from Zuko's surrender. It will color how they remember him, he knows that. Perhaps they'll think he betrayed them, or perhaps they'll work out who he is and know that he lied all this time. But there's no use in dwelling on that, on regretting that his last interaction with Katara and Aang was with Zuko on his knees before his sister, or regretting that his last interaction with Sokka was twisted up and painful and confusing. Zuko might only have hours to think of anything at all, so he decides that he's going to spend it with gratitude. He sends a prayer to Acme, and it isn't right. He doesn't remember the wording anymore, and he can't see the sun from here anyway. But it will have to do. So he pictures the 4 of them and thinks of the happier moments they'd spent together. He remembers being confused but also amused by their interactions. He remembers them being kind to him and to anyone they came across. He does his best to remember what their smiles look like. And then he sends another prayer that they will win this, that they'll all survive and grow into adulthood. And then Zuko lets himself think about Mother. Azula had wanted to know about her, but she'd only been interested in Mother's death. Zuko mostly remembers Mother dying, too, and the long weeks that Zuko had spent watching it happen and being helpless to stop it. But again, he decides that this isn't worth dwelling on right now. So Zuko thinks instead of how brave she had been, taking them to the Earth Kingdom. He thinks of how gentle her hands had been when they had run through Zuko's newly shorn hair, how warm her body was when she curled up around Zuko at night, how she had assured him that he was loved up until she had lost the ability to speak. Zuko feels the sun set even though he can't see it, and he curls up in a corner and lets himself fall asleep. There's no fight left in him for anything, even staying awake in these last short hours. They arrive at daybreak. Azula hasn't slept, and Ty Lee keeps bothering her about it. Azula has sent a message ahead of her that she's bringing an important prisoner, but she hasn't specified that it's Zuko. Azula doesn't know whether Father will want to keep his existence quiet for the remainder of the war, after all. She goes to wake Zuko and bring him herself, because she's itching to look at him. It's an awful feeling crawling against the inside of her skin, and she needs to make it stop. When they pull Zuko from the brig, he looks resigned. Azula walks beside him, facing forward as is proper for a princess, but occasionally glancing over to see him. Zuko stares out at Caldera City, and Azula finds herself inexplicably annoyed that he isn't looking at her. "The more you tell us about the Avatar, the more useful you are," she advises. Zuko turns his head and meets her eyes, and they walk in silence for a moment before he says, "Azula, you do know that I won't betray them, don't you?" "It might take some work, but he will betray them. In exchange for life, most people will betray anyone, and even if he won't do it for his life, then he'll do it for relief from pain." She doesn't want it to come to that, not really. She wants Zuko to see sense and do the right thing, but if it comes down to it, his life is worth some pain. They enter the palace. May and Ty Lee can't go much further, but Ty Lee reaches out and touches Azula's shoulder before they break away. Azula nods and continues. Azula stays by Zuko's side as they enter the throne room. She only breaks away when it's necessary, when the guards force him to his knees before the Fire Lord. Azula steps some paces away for everyone's safety and then turns a calculated smile on the Fire Lords. "What is this?" the Fire Lord asks, standing from the throne. Zuko's head is high, even though he's been pushed low. His hair needs a cut and is hanging into his eyes, and he's dressed in Earth Kingdom green, but Azula would recognize his face anywhere. And Father even knows about the scar, so he must recognize his own son. There's a part of her that thinks that she was destined to find her brother again and bring him home. It's a stupid, childish part of her that she wrestles into submission. But it's still there. "Hello, Father," Zuko says. The Fire Lord stares down at his son for long, long moments. "Daughter," he says, eventually lifting his eyes to her. "Explain." "Azula's posture is perfect. Her expression is perfect," she begins. "He has been working with the Avatar," she introduces, because this is the most pertinent information. "I recognized him immediately, of course, and now I have captured him. He'll have important information." The Fire Lord continues to watch her, his expression sharp and focused. "I asked you to bring me the Avatar, not this." She notices that he says "this," as if Zuko is a thing. She keeps her breaths and her heart rate steady. "This will lead us to the Avatar," Azula explains. Azula only needs Zuko imprisoned right now. She can allow the surprise to fade before she starts working on her plan to keep him alive in the long run. The Fire Lord continues to watch her. Azula feels inexplicably small. "Why did you not inform me of your brother's whereabouts?" Azula raises her chin further. "I had not wanted to put it into writing, lest it be intercepted and force your hand," she explains. "He is more useful as a secret." "As a secret from me?" the Fire Lord asks. "Never," Azula responds, firm and true. Father hums, looking from Azula to Zuko. Zuko is still holding his head high. Azula can respect that. He still acts like royalty, even after almost 6 years as a peasant, even kneeling on the stone floor of the throne room. She wonders if this was the room where Father had burned Zuko's face. She doesn't allow herself to dwell on it. "He is useful," the Fire Lord allows, and Azula feels something in the back of her mind relax. This is step 1 of her plan. It's time to start perfecting the details of step 2. "However," Father continues, "there is one problem." Azula hesitates. "A problem, Father?" The Fire Lord looks back to Azula, his gaze piercing. You are strong, my daughter, he states. Azula allows herself the smallest smile. Your soul is made of iron and fire, and he, the Fire Lord continues, not even bothering to look at Zuko, is a weakness. His weakness will lead us to the Avatar, Azula reminds him. Zuko's weakness will be good for them. The Fire Lord smiles just slightly. I meant that he is your weakness, Azula, he explains. Azula goes cold. She rushes to correct him, but she can't quite figure out how. Is father right? Is Zuko her weakness? The Fire Lord turns his head to look at his son again. Zuko, Azula notices, is looking up at Azula. He's looking at her like he's trying to memorize her. Azula realizes he thinks, Gods, father says, and Azula keeps looking back at Zuko as his eyes flit from her face to her hair to her hands, as Zuko's face gives away nothing except that he wants to see her. Kill the boy. Azula's mind goes blank. That's the only explanation she has for what happens next. The guard behind Zuko stops, and his sword clatters to the stone. Azula pulls a pearl-handed dagger from the guard's neck. And then everything happens very fast. Run! She snaps at Zuko, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet, and she blasts their way out of the room. There's a pause of seconds before her father starts flinging his own fire, but it's long enough. Azula is out of the room, dragging Zuko behind her. The guard outside the door snags Zuko by his bound wrists, and Zuko twists and pulls off a kick to the guard's face, and then they're running again. They round the corner, Azula's arms raised and her fire true, ready for another fight, only to find that the guards are already knocked out. What? How? They continue running. This way! Ty Lee calls from around a bend, and they double back and follow her voice. There's a seemingly endless route of unconscious guards. At the end of it, May is pulling knives out of the wall, and Ty Lee thrusts a bundle of clothing at them. Zuko stumbles, and Azula pulls him along, practically dragging him. She takes an overshirt from Ty Lee's arms and throws it around Zuko's shoulders, disguising the Earth Kingdom colors with Fire Nation red. How did you know? Azula asks. May leans against the knife-free wall and raises her eyebrows. Well, I mean, duh! There's no time! Ty Lee insists. Down the corridor to the left to the secret passage that Liu Ten used to use. Go that way! Aren't you coming with us? Azula asks. You can't stay behind. You've committed treason. Oh, fire and ash, Azula has committed treason. Nobody saw us, May insists. What do you think we are, amateurs? Ty Lee throws her arms around Azula, and then she hugs Zuko, too. Stay safe, she says, and run fast! They take off again. At the end of Liu Ten's passage is the last person Azula expects. Well, maybe she should have expected him. He's a useless old man, but he'd also loved Zuko, and he never seems to give up on wanting to have tea with Azula and talk her ear off with useless proverbs. My niece and nephew, Iroh greets them, holding his arms out. Neither of the siblings go forward to him. Iroh doesn't seem to mind. He approaches them, one hand on either of their shoulders, and smiles warmly. You will need to keep each other safe now, Iroh says. You will be in danger until this war is over. Zuko inhales sharply, and Azula looks towards him. He's staring at Iroh with wide eyes. Did you... he asks, and then trails off for a moment. I don't remember much about that night. I was really out of it after the... but this feels familiar. Iroh smiles. Ah, yes, nephew. We have been here before. Oh, Zuko says, and then turns his eyes to Azula. Azula, you... Let's go, Azula says. We don't have time for family reunions right now. Thank you, Uncle. Zuko says and executes a bow. His hands are still bound, so he cannot make the sign of the flame. Azula wonders if he even would have. Iroh bows back. You will need to find the White Lotus, he tells the pair, and put your trust in them. I will see you again, my niece and nephew. Come on, Azula says, grasping at Zuko's arm, and they continue to flee. She's committing treason. She committed treason automatically without even weighing her options. Father was right. Zuko is her weakness. They run and run and run, but Caldera City is not an easy place to escape from. You did this before, Azula snaps when they find some brief cover. How did you and Mother escape? Zuko purses his lips, staring into the distance. We ended up on a ship, he says. And pointed up! How did you get there? Azula asks. Who did you trust? How did you hide yourselves? I don't know, Zuko replies, shifting to look her in the face. I don't think I was conscious for much of it. His face had been half burnt off that night. Zuko might not have been conscious at all. What is Azula doing? What is she doing? Zuko looks up to the sky again and then stares. Azula shifts to see what he's looking at. Is that? She asks, hardly believing it. Zuko frowns. That's Appa, he says, and then his expression clears and he adds, they found Appa. Azula scowls. But they won't find us, she points out and feels impossibly better. Zuko's friends are launching a rescue mission, but they would have been too late. Zuko would have bled out on the throne room floor just minutes before their arrival, and they're too late now anyway because the bison is en route to the palace and Zuko and Azula are hiding! Zuko continues to watch the sky, and then Azula sees the smallest smile bloom on his face. What? Azula asks. Zuko shifts, twisting his cuffed hands until he can reach his belt. After a moment, he pulls out a small wooden whistle. I was on bison whistle duty when you found me,